Welcome everybody to our
Okay.
Plexus pop-up conversation on adaptive space. This is so exciting. One, it's so nice to see new and long-term members of the Plexus network and community. And Michael, we're just delighted that you're here for all the connections that you have within the network and your book, which just is fabulous. And we're excited that you've taken the time to share it with us. So I am going to put myself on mute, and remember, the most important thing is this is your time with Michael. Michael, this is your time with the network. So feel free to add anything you want in the chat, and then at varying points, have questions. And we hope that you'll walk away with understanding that we're looking at lots of ways to really promote complexity thinking in all organizations. And there is no one right way to get there or to think about it, but the fact is that we're together thinking about it. So thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Denise. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And what I'm hoping to do is just have a conversation. I've got slides because I don't know how to help myself, and I've got a lot of network diagrams, and need to tell a story through connecting some dots for you. But mostly, I'll spend a little bit of time on the front end, but mostly I want to spend some time simply talking about some research and how it connects to complexity, and more precisely, some of the discoveries that we have had. So I'll do a little bit of context setting, and I'm going to hope to get through this rather quickly so we can just have an open dialogue. But if you need to interrupt me at any point, feel free. Let's do that. But in essence, I have been a part of a research team for the last decade and a half who's been really interested in one core thought. And we very much started out with a complexity lens. And that core thought or research question was quite simply, why is it that some organizations seem to be adaptive and responsive to the outside world and the growing chaos that exists in this era of disruption, and yet seemingly equally fit corporations and or large organizations are not? And that was one single question that we were armed with. And a small research team of us went out and started interviewing people, again, about 15 years ago. What we discovered was a bit surprising to us. We entered into it under this lens of emergence. We were looking for, all the different things that you could imagine from a complexity standpoint, a complex adaptive system. What does it look like, for local interactions? We were interested in, literally, we coded most of the initial data sets, which were qualitative, around complexity dimensions. And, people like Russ Marion, Mary Ulbein were engaged in this research initiative from the very beginning. And we were looking for, a real strong empirical, complex adaptive system story. What we discovered, however, was a bit of a surprise even to us. And I'm going to really share that through the first story, but you might not be surprised based on the title of this slide, is that, the difference between those companies that were adaptive and those that were not had to do with, it was social. It would have as much to do with social capital and the way people were connected to each other as anything else. And, I'll dive deep into the story, but I'm going to share a couple illustrations first off that will really get to this. The first illustration was a financial services company, which was one of the companies we analyzed at length. And we were simply interested in, we actually discovered this by surprise, but we were interested in an integration. And if you look on the left-hand side of the diagram that I have up here, this particular company, which is represented by the pink dots, the purple dots here, was acquiring a smaller, more entrepreneurial company. The bigger company, and this is only a subset of that organization, not the entire organization, could be thought of as a fairly mechanistic, sort of scalable execution machine, if you will. The smaller company was thought of and acquired simply because it was more innovative and entrepreneurial. So the thought process was this, large company is going to acquire this small company, and pardon me, was going to fully leverage its capacity to be more innovative and leverage the innovations and ideas that it had. 6 months in, on the left-hand side, the only people that were connected between those two entities were the people inside, this bubble, which happened to be on the integration team. The people who were engaged in the smaller, more entrepreneurial company were miserable. They hated this, acquisition. They screamed and raged against the fact that this larger entity was stifling out every creative, idea that it happened to have. It seemed like a marriage made for. It seemed like a marriage that was a disaster. But then something surprising happened. And if you look on the right-hand side, in an unintended manner, people were pulled from the smaller entity because they were great leaders deeper into the core of the, more execution-oriented organization. And you can see what happens about 18 months in with this network. As people are pulled into the organization, they bring their friends with them. In other words, as people from the center of the blue dot on the left-hand side are pulled into sub-pockets of, the larger organization, what they bring along with them are their relationships. And then the surprise was this. When that happened, all of a sudden the innovation started to pop. So we did not, we weren't looking for this. We discovered this. And quite frankly, what started to happen was, the people who were connected to other points of influence inside the organization were able to bring the ideas that they originally wanted to, but couldn't get formally endorsed. They brought them into the organization through their social relationships. So, that's an acquisition. That was a surprise to us. And we began to think about, well, maybe this is an issue that's much more social than around setting up systems and thinking about leadership. That really struck us hard in the second story. This is a medical device facility. It's almost the inverse of the previous story. These are numerous sub-pockets, or you could even call them silos within this medical device facility. And in the center of this organization, these small white dots was a centralized innovation team. This centralized innovation team represented some very smart PhDs, some very brilliant design thinkers, about 35 in entirety, and across a 3-year time frame. This is one snapshot, but across a 3-year time frame, that group of 35 centralized innovators had a success rate of marketplace successes of 0. In other words, their hit rate in the marketplace was 0. So like any good manager, if you're not successful, what do? You diffuse it and you basically shut it down. That's exactly what was decided. The good news here for us as researchers was that these people were pushed out into the business because they were really smart. And then something remarkable happened when that move happened. After these people were reorganized, much like the first case study, innovation started popping all over the organization. So, by mistake in 2 cases, and then many other cases as we dug deeper and started to snowball these interviews back, we started to discover that it's not about the idea at all. It's about the social placement of those ideas on the network that seemed to matter most. And that was not something we were looking for. We did think that the network and connectivity had something to do with it, because clearly, that's a complex adaptive system, but we weren't thinking about the cadencing of those networks. So from that emerged a model, a framework that looks like this. And I'm going to draw some parallels back to some origins in complexity science from this. But if you could think about this, the 2 things that existed in every one of these 60 plus companies, where every company had a fairly formidable operational system. You could think of that as the formal ways to get stuff done inside of an organization. Somewhat more surprising, but not completely surprising, was every single organization had local pockets, we call them entrepreneurial pockets, of great ideas. Even those organizations that weren't adaptive had really good ideas. They had the seeds of what they needed already within the organization, but it was only the ones that were adaptive that had the third dimension, which is what we call adaptive space. Now, if you go back to my 2 case studies, adaptive space can quite simply be thought of as the free flow of ideas into and across an organization so that they can be explored, exchanged, and debated in such a way that they can actually stand up and become formal. So I want to now, for those of you who are deep complexity people, I want to take you back to, Roger Lewin's book, where I can't remember if it was John Langley or who, but, the diagram that we all know today that shows a complex adaptive system with agents, interacting at the bottom of the diagram, a new emergent order coming out that, is in a cloud-like diagram, sort of the new order, and then that system playing back upon itself. This is our version of that model through our discovered research. We think these local interactions in the pockets, can emerge, into a new order that's the new formal operational system that feeds back on future entrepreneurial pockets. And the discovery we have here is that we think adaptive space is the key to making that happen. And I'm going to describe that in more detail next. But it's simply, adaptive space can quite simply be thought of as a free exchange zone where ideas can be transferred from these local pockets, both inside and outside of the organization, and scaled into the formal operational systems so that they can generate value and economies of scale in these adaptive organizations. So the rest of what I want to share before we open up for dialogue is exactly how we think this happens. And this is what the book, Adaptive Space, is about. But quite simply, it's not just social arrangements. It's not just social interactions that matter, but it's the cadencing of these, interactions through what we described as 4 social arrangements that matter most. So if you think about it this way, and this is where I'm going to ingrain what we now know about network science and network analytics to the whole next level. If you think about it this way, if you need to discover new ideas, if you really are in the need of discovering, new insights, you've got to get outside of the insular organization that exists in most cases. And all these adaptive organizations were incredible at discovery. The way you do that is through bridging connections, through brokerage, we would say quite simply. And you do that by, ensuring that you're pushing people onto the center of the organization through things like design thinking to go discover something new in the world. But that's not enough, because ideas are cheap. And mostly what we discovered is these organizations already had good ideas. What they didn't have was the ability to bring these ideas to life. And that's where these development arrangements matter most. Amazon calls them 2 pizza teams. These can be thought of as cohesive clusters, or entrepreneurial pockets deep inside of an organization that are super good at iteration, local interactions, elaboration, and refinement or experimentation. And that happens because you've got a small band of 6, maybe 8 people who are very fiercely connected with each other, deep trust, and they're willing to share ideas with one another in such a way that they take greater risk. And it's important because we all know that the initial idea is never the concept that will get implemented. It's just a seedling. So these iterations, as we know of them, and we very frequently talk about iteration inside of complex adaptive systems, have to happen in these tight, cohesive, semi-protected pockets inside of the organization. And once you know that, you can design for it and you can create these social arrangements, with some foresight. But that's not enough. What we know is that, and this is Lee Fleming's work from Harvard, what we know is that ideas that are developed inside these cohesive pockets are 43% more likely to be rejected by the broader organization. In basic change management, we call that the not invented here phenomenon, right? So you've got to get these ideas out of these pockets where people build great ownership, and it's good to bring them into the world, but it's not enough to get them diffused. That's where diffusion connections come into play. And this is where we really lean on 2 different theoretical underpinnings of what's happening with network science. One is brokerage. Brokers pull ideas out of the pockets and span across the organization. And Ron Burt spent a ton of time really elevating that theory to the level of we know that these ideas are shared and diffused quite frequently through brokerage. But there's another element of this that matters almost as much, and that is this concept of energy. And Rob Cross and Wayne Baker in particular have done some really pinnacle work in regards to energizers on the network. And what their research says is that energizers pick up ideas from these small cohesive clusters, and with a fourfold impact, can actually diffuse them out across an organization. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a network diagram in a moment. But again, that's not enough. They have to become the new normal. They have to be embedded inside of that new operational system. And to do that, you've got to break down brick walls, and you've got to disrupt, sort of the social bubbles that exist today inside of organizations. And that's where disruption connections lie. So I want to take you just on another short journey before we, again, have a conversation about what this means. And here's an illustration of, there we go. Here's an illustration of what discovery could look like. So this is a network diagram where we looked at 130 different people inside this network diagram. This is how we can measure discovery. We look at, this was external discovery in this particular case. We look at who the bridge people are. The blue dots in this case are a development team. The purple dots or pink dots are the people who exist outside of the organization. So a completely insular organization wouldn't have any of those pink dots. But this particular case has, a lot of discovery already taken place. And I know this organization in context. And this is, most of those pink dots are universities in particular, or research partners. And there are at least 10 people that really own these predominant bridge connections. The white dots here are really bridge brokers, what we call brokers. They're bridging ties to the outside world. And what they do is they're constantly bringing in this influx of discovery so that the other blue dots inside this development diagram are able to have access, as Ron Bird suggests, access to three competitive advantages: access to new information more quickly than most people, so access to novel information more quickly than most people would, access to diverse sets of information that the blue dots wouldn't more typically have access to, and then just as importantly as those first two, control over the diffusion of how those ideas are introduced into the organization. A good example of this is what IBM does with their innovation scouts. IBM has these, brokers that are designed precisely to do exactly what this diagram is suggesting needs to be done, and that is constantly bridge into the outside world so that people can discover new things. But as I shared before, that's not enough. You've got to bring these things into the world. And here's another illustration to show that. The right-hand side of this chart are the blue dots I just showed you. So if you just took the pink dots out for a moment and only looked at the internal people, those are represented by green on the right-hand side. That is a traditional development model, but the left-hand side is the model that I want. The left-hand side are these small, cohesive two-pocket teams, that are designed to move at speed. The reason they move at speed is because they've got great social cohesion and very tight sets of relationships where everybody knows everybody. And it's almost as if you can think of this, I think of it, my metaphor that I use very frequently, it's more than a metaphor, it's an illustration, is the Navy SEALs teams. They develop very cohesive trust to the point when they're really, executing, they're fluidly moving, and they know who to go to. They know who all the people, they know everybody on the team, and they can almost intuitively anticipate where people are going to be. It turns out that this is a phenomenal design for moving fast into a unpredictable world. And this particular case, I won't share the actual innovation that's happening here, but I would just say that this particular design on the left-hand side has created 4 generations of a new technology in less than 18 months. And the way they've been able to do that is through rapid iteration. Each of those small colored pockets have one task at hand. They're small 2-pizza teams with a single thread task. Every single day they get new data and they start to process on that data where they're perfecting their algorithms or they're perfecting their software development. And then they plug it into the machine at the end of the day. So it's a sync and stabilize model. This is what we oftentimes see with agile design and development. And that what it enables you to do is move super fast to create new models of things that have never been designed in the past. The right-hand model is the antithesis of that. This is far more typical of what we see. Certainly, this was true in those non-adaptive organizations. And what you get there are the individual people or nodes are working on 3 or 4 projects at the same time. They're working with a combination of different people on each project. And what you get is confusion. It can develop. You can develop in this model, but it's not nearly as fast as the model on the left-hand side. Fact is, the model on the left-hand side is up to 20% faster than the model on the right-hand side. So if you want to develop something at speed, with speed, and you want to rapidly iterate it, using conventional innovation technologies or theory, if you will, like design thinking, it's the model on the left that's superior. So that's what we look for as we're thinking about rapid development. But remember, we've got to diffuse it. So let me talk a bit about Energizers. So this is a network, just as an example, of 750 people. This is a network, where we actually map out energy, and we do that by simply asking people in this network, in the network, who are the people that most energize you. I picked 2 super energizers in this particular case, and using some of Kratakowicz and James Fowler's work on, connected, the power of social networks, we used an algorithm to, kind of the 3-degree rule of influencing of friends. And we used that algorithm in this particular map. And what we recognize is these 2 super energizers light up 23% of the network. In other words, using some good influencing theory, these 2 people can literally act as a tipping point for an entire organization of 750 people just by their energy alone. It's really important to mention that these 2 individuals have no authority, no formal authority whatsoever. They're both 20-something, individual contributors, and they literally have tipped this particular organization over and become catalysts for diffusing not just one idea, but many ideas across this broader network. And there were more than 2 energizers in this network. I just picked the 2 extremes to really illustrate our message. If I pick the top 10, that entire network begins to light up. So these energizers, when properly placed and socially arranged with some degree of intentionality, but yet high degrees of unpredictability, we don't exactly know how this is going to manifest on the network. They have tremendous influence, and that's how we think about this as adaptive space. So to summarize this, and this is a little bit of a mangled mess. Sorry, I usually use phase-ins on this one, but we weren't able to get the slides to work correctly. But let me just walk you through this story as a summary. If you look at the green dots on the upper right-hand side, think of that as the operational system. I oftentimes describe that as the blob, right? That's the super tanker that delivers at efficiency and scale. It serves a very grand purpose, and it's critically important. And I think sometimes as complexity science people, we oftentimes throw out the role of formal structures. They still do play a role, but it's the other dynamics deeper inside this diagram that matter most to me. Those small 2 pockets in the gray are the fast, agile, nimble teams. In fact, if I took all the connections out and reran the algorithm, that would look much like that fast speed diagram I showed a few slides ago. These 2 entities in particular are moving really, really fast. They've got good discovery because they're connected to the outside world. In this case, they're using design thinking to do that. There are many ways to do discovery, but it's these diffusion connections that I think are the most important of anything that I've said. These bridge ties, high energy bridge ties that link the super tanker of the green dots with the speedboats of these 2 smaller entities is the magic and the adaptive space that helps to pull these entrepreneurial pockets into the new core. And in summary, that's what we describe as adaptive space. It's the cadencing of these ongoing 4 sets of connections. These diffusion connections ultimately, help to seed the network to where you disrupt it with a new entity, with a new idea. And what we have discovered, first of all, through qualitative interviewing, and since then, we've been able to replicate by, plugging in these intentional social arrangements, is really emergence at its best. And, I can talk much more about the practical side of that, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on the front end before I turn it over to a dialogue to talk a little bit about what adaptive space is and how we've been able to really plug it in and create new management practices to enable an agile organization. So Denise, that's what I wanted to share. It took a little longer because I can get carried away with and geek out on all this stuff. But I just wanted to set some context, and now we'll just open it up. What questions or thoughts or challenges might you have? Anyone?
This is Mark Norcus Kramer. I'll start off with a question. My experience is that senior management plays a significant role in whether this occurs or not, this diffusion. So where my experience is that we had a small group of real innovators, and in one management environment, those people were encouraged and felt as if they were part of the organization and part of an important part of an organization. And then the management shifted over to somebody who was much more frightened and conservative. And we fell back into a position of feeling it was us against them and began to become insular. So I'd like for you to talk a little bit about the role of the senior management in creating this kind of environment that permits this kind of innovation to diffuse.
Yeah, so there are two levels of leadership that matter a lot to this, and I have to say that we entered into this with a complexity leadership lens. So what we were most interested in the original research was, what role does leadership play in making this happen? What we discovered is that the role of, and we can debate this and banter back and forth, but if you can actually create these intentional connections, that the role of leadership might not be as important and as critical as we have once thought. Now, there is a caveat to that. There are two places where it's essential. If you don't create enough enabling space, for some of these interactions to happen, nothing gets off the ground. So if you've got a leader who is incredibly fearful and is stifling, all these conversations and completely dedicated to only the core engine and only execution on a day-to-day basis, and there's 0 degree of freedom for people to interact, you can never get liftoff. So it is true that there's this role, we call it enabling leadership, and we think that enabling leadership at least needs to provide loose permission, but not quite sponsorship. They just need to allow people to move a bit more freely throughout an organization so that they can self-organize into something more dramatic. Where leadership matters most in our research is the bridge to getting these ideas from diffusion into disruption. What we have found is that's where leadership plays the most critical role, and that's where we call it sponsorship. And that's where these ideas need to be sponsored, because it's at that point that they truly need to be resourced from the formal entity. And, I would say that's the hardest move in everything I've described. And that's where leadership has an essential role. I have seen lots of things, and I can say this, with real stories that have emerged with very little leadership support. Now, it didn't have great stifling from leadership, but very little leadership support until you get to this final move. And there are some things that we have discovered about how to usher in that final move. And the way to do that is less about leader and more about how do you seed the network so that your network begins to do some of your work for you. And I don't have this diagram here, but I sometimes describe, I've got one study that we conducted where there's a completely partitioned off bubble that is the leadership team. They are disconnected predominantly from the rest of the organization. And we were able to run a study where we saw that if you could just influence a handful of people on the edges of that bubble, they end up doing much of your work for you and help to get you invited into the leadership team. So leadership matters, but it's not quite the same way that we've talked about leadership in the past. So I hope that was helpful.
Hi, Michael. Thank you. This is so fascinating.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Two questions. One, I would love to go back to the slide where you had the social network and then the other networks. So
the two side by side?
Yes, the two side by side. Thank you. Speed network. Thank you. The speed network and the other one. So the question I have is really twofold. One, how did the brokers bring feedback into the larger system? And two, do you find within the speed network that there are specific nodes, let's say the orange group versus the blue group, that start to dominate within that network? And I know that's contextually appropriate, but and if that's too, you don't have to answer it, but I've just been holding that throughout.
Yeah. So this network, so I'm going to put this network in the context of another one to tell the story. But this particular network this is actually not the entire organization now. It was back then. It was about 150 people. 123 participated in this study. Each of those individual pockets, some of them are less distinct than others. We actually went to work on that after this study. But those independent pockets all have very specific purposes. They're each accountable for a very specific element in a bigger growth path. So there is unity in the way that these groups are broken out. The center mechanism, which is really important, is kind of the stabilizing mechanism. So in this particular case, what happens is those outside circles move really fast throughout the week, iterating on daily updates. And then, once or twice a week, they sort of synchronize in the center to make sure that all the bits and pieces fit together. And it was designed literally to do that. Now, to answer your broker question, because I call this a development network in its entirety, to answer your brokerage question, so that same diagram that I just showed you is right here. It's one of these development circles. At some point, it's going to become the new core, and we built very distinctive brokerage bridging connections to keep that pocket, entrepreneurial pocket, loosely connected by design. So here's what happens. If I reran just that algorithm for this group and separated all these out, it would look exactly like that previous diagram. It just happens to be different because of adding in. Networks are meshed on top of networks. So every time you add a different element, it will rerun. But if we reran it, you would see a bunch of two pizza teams in here. But the most important part of this is these protectors. These bridge connections hold these people back from helping too early. Remember, I said these people are all single focused, one thing. So this is where leadership matters immensely. This was designed in this particular case to where the bridge people are connecting or protecting that entity to do what it can do quickly. At some point, and equally as important, at some point when that becomes a minimum viable product that is commercially feasible, then those bridge connections begin to pull this entity slowly but surely back in closer to the blob so that it can be endorsed and formalized. And that's when you get true disruption. And that's the theory. We have first discovered that, and secondly, ushered those moves in a multitude of times. So in that case, leadership truly does matter. And we're trying to almost prescribe the timing of those moves. And in some cases, that might take 18 months. In other cases, that might be 18 weeks. And it just depends on the nature of what's being designed and developed.
Thank you. So
what else?
Questions emerged from that, but I'm not going to be the only person asking questions. So if anybody wants to jump in, just unmute yourself. And if you,
Yes.
Michael, if you'd like to keep the slides up, that's fine. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, that's fine. Whatever works for you.
I'd like to follow up on that if I can. Michael, it's exciting, and the questions that were just asked. You know, in the previous thing, you talked about speed networks. One of the important things here is the slowing down, the creating space, the protecting autonomy, as opposed to speeding up. We've, I think, all seen organizations that want to get there faster, so speeding up is the norm. Getting there first, and shortcuts to that actually become short circuits, cause things not to happen. And whether it's in the SEALs teams or in these types of things, the protection of autonomy and space for people to not multitask, to focus in on one thing is, I think, critical. So it just shows, I think, what's not said but implied is the pausing so that one responds and doesn't react to situations is important. The space, the creation of space for others to perform.
Yeah, Alan, I 100% agree with all that. So what ends up happening is, you know, there are times this model overall at the aggregate is faster. However, there are time frames where, you know, certainly things are being slowed down. You know, I don't want to have scaling conversations before I have a minimum viable product. You know, if this mechanism over here hasn't done its job and it hasn't stood up something that is commercially viable, you know, presuming it's a product or a service, then to talk about all the other things like risk and, you know, liability and how do you scale this, how do you get it into operations, all those conversations are premature. So part of this is slowing down the machine from doing what the machine does naturally, so that the development activity can sort of take its time to create something that is viable, you know, for commercial success at the right thresholds and levels. And you know, one of the things that happens in this model is you do have to think a bit like a startup on the edge, and you do that by setting milestones, and you do that by setting success factors to know that this thing has, you know, reached success when it's solved these three problems. And then as you pull it closer and closer, those other more core questions about how do you scale become more critical. And that's where the bridging, you know, ties help to bring that in. It's also important to say, and I don't have this model in here, sometimes these things need to be shut down. You know, if they don't reach, like any good startup, if they don't reach their milestones and thresholds within the parameters that are desired, then you've got to decide, do I decommission these things? So if I were to draw this map more sort of holistically, you might have 7 or 8 of these bets on the edges at any point in time, knowing that not all 7 or 8 are ever going to manifest into something that's viable, but you're going to constantly have many people describe this as ambidextrous leadership, where you've got growth and core happening in the same entity. So I've spent a lot of time with Charles O'Reilly talking about this in particular from Stanford. And, you know, you've got to also be willing to decommission some of these bets on the edges as well, because you can't continue to sink cash into them if they don't look feasible and promising over the long haul.
I have a couple
Can
questions.
I ask a question?
Please.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I think this is a remarkable weaving of so many of concepts that around social capital and ambidexterity and stuff. Just an incredible synthesis here. Just technical questions on obviously on the energizing diagrams, you're asking who energizes you. On most of these other things, what's the relationship type you're using? It's one question. Another one is who are you working with? What's the range of organizations that you've looked at? You've highlighted 2 here.
Yeah. So remind me if I forget one of your questions. I didn't write them down. You know, but I'll start with the range first, and then I'll go backward to go forward. So we tried to look at, you know, we've looked at nonprofits, we've looked at large corporations, we've looked at healthcare, we were very cognizant to look at companies that we determined as being adaptive, and we used, BCG Boston Consulting Group has a adaptation index. We leveraged that. So, the pure research design was to look at an assortment of organizations. The first phase was to just get access to a bunch of organizations and create a theory construct. The second one was to go look at adaptive organizations intentionally and try to do some validation around that theory. And we've iterated many, many times on that theory. The third wave was to actually try to put it into place. And frankly, that's what I've done here at General Motors, is to, the final play was to think of this place as a living laboratory. And can you actually make this happen, proactively as opposed to studying it retroactively? I've worked with lots of people to help do the theory construct, and I've mentioned many of those names. People like Ron Burke have been instrumental in sort of formulating our thoughts, and then everyone else from Lee Fleming. Rob Krauss is the person I would say to you has been most influential on me personally, as he's thought through many of these concepts. But each of them brings something different to the equation. And this leads into your first question. On the network position, I'm really interested in two roles, and two roles mainly, and those are the brokers, which is where Ron Burke's work really fit in. Those are the bridge people, and then the central connectors, which are the people like in the center of these tight cohesive groups. If you can find those two groups of people, you can make a lot happen. And I believe now I'm a talent management person at my day job is in talent management. And I believe that we're going to be talking as much about social capital as we have in the next decade as we have human capital over the past 2 decades. And I think, the best way to think about that is you could be the smartest person in the world, but if you're not socially positioned to be able to leverage what you know, it's useless to a company. So thinking about social positioning and this concept of what Ron Burke described as oscillation, which is really moving back and forth between those two roles. The best story, this is anecdotal, but the best story I can give you is one of the magic things that happened in this particular case study is we picked up the most credible person inside the core of this blob up here. One of the single most credible people who was deeply entrenched in the operational system, and moved them out to the edge and told them that their job is to reinvent the future and protect this entity over here. Now, we did that kind of by mistake, to be honest, but that person has been instrumental because everybody over here knows them, trusts them, and has deep credibility with them. And that equipped them to be a phenomenal bridge person to protect this entity on the left-hand side, and then from time to time, pull it closer and closer to the super tanker so that in the long term, it can be endorsed and scaled. So hopefully I answered all your questions, Jim.
Almost perfectly. It wasn't about, the first question was about relationship type. Cross and Bert both use, who do you get advice from? Did you use that, or what did you use to determine these relationships?
Numerous things. In this particular case, it was who do you interact with on a day-to-day basis? And then we asked a series of contextual questions, much like Ron and Rob. Who do you go to for new ideas? This is the daily network of people you interact with that you see right here.
Thanks.
Okay, absolutely.
This is Mark Narcus Kramer. Going to have another question. In my company, we developed something called an outcome leader. So we actually formalized some of these roles. And when I developed a diagram of my organization, I didn't write it as a hierarchical diagram. I developed it as a network diagram. I was wondering if that way of organizing a company is liberating or stifling in the sense that it might, that these roles might change rapidly and you don't want to necessarily fix them, but liberating in the sense that, it becomes clear who's responsible. So my job was called outcome leader. And my job was not only to work within the organization, but to understand the environment around us, to know whether an innovation or an idea would be politically, economically, not just technically viable.
Yeah, I think, so I need to know a little bit more about an outcome leader, to answer the question concretely, Mark.
I just want to say,
in our case,
we wrote the organizational structure as a network rather than as a hierarchical structure. And I was wondering if in some sense that is a better way to do an organizational chart for people to know, or whether it's stifling because in some sense these roles and responsibilities are very fluid when you have a dynamic organization.
Yeah, this is a really interesting, so I'm going to come at this maybe from a different point. You can tell me if I respond to your question directly or not. But this has been a really interesting debate that you bring up for the research team. We've had some people on the research team across the time frame that were pure complexity science individuals and believe that there was no role for formality. There was no role for formal leadership whatsoever. There was no role for top-down strategy. And, we've had some highly spirited debates about this topic. My view, and I won't represent the research team on this, is I think all those things are necessary and insufficient by themselves. I think, we still live in the world of formal organizations. Those formal organizations are incredibly competent at scaling. And when we become latched into them and locked into them, we limit our ability to be adaptive. So I'll give you the best way I can answer the question is I think your organizational charts in a formal construct, top-down manner, are obsolete the moment they're drawn. But they still seem to bring a sense of comfort to people. And I don't diminish that sense of comfort. I know who's at the end of the day accountable for something. And I also know that that's not necessarily the person I need to work with on a day-to-day basis to get stuff done. So I think I'm going to almost cop out on your question and say it's a both and. I think you need some degree of comfort in knowing that these formal organizations exist. It's like a vision. Is a vision compelling to an organization? Must an organization have a vision? And my personal philosophy is it brings a sense of comfort to people that at least gets them enough alignment and coherence to at least rally around something. And then you hold it loosely and wait and see what emerges. And I think a real learning, agile organization believes both are true, but doesn't entirely over-index on either. And I think the beauty of what we've done here is, yes, we started with top-down strategy. Yes, we've done a lot. And if I have more time, I'd tell you all kinds of stories about organic, bottom-up, non-planned, unsanctioned activities that have emerged, that had to morph over time, have emerged and generated energy. And, there's something we've done here called GM 2020 that have basically no formal support whatsoever. But it emerged into a network of about 5,000 people who were highly passionate about changing the way we do things. And over time, that bottom-up energy had to be morphed and recalibrated and rechanneled into top-down initiatives. And it's really this, it's that mashup of those two entities that creates great resilience. Because if you're doing something that's not strategically imperative, it'll get shut down ultimately. But if you're doing something that only has top-down energy and not bottom-up energy, you get passive compliance. And the bottom-up, top-down mashup that we have experienced here has created this real sense of energy, and frankly, an organization that was quite rigid and bureaucratic in the way that we had thought about things in the past. So it's really been the combination of those two things, Mark, both formalization, formal org charts, and knowing who the true influencers are that have been the magic behind this.
You didn't quite answer my question because I buy your premise. My question was, we went from representing the organization as a network rather than a hierarchy. And my question is, in representing, because that's still our formal structure, we had roles for people like your connectors, we would call them outcome leaders. The question is, once we do that, do we, in some sense, harm the ability for the organization to operate in a fluid way? So, the question for me is, should we try to formalize this informal structure by having titles like outcome leader or disruptor, whatever it is, or does that in some sense will that ultimately hurt the dynamic flow of this?
Yeah, I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer to the question, Mark. My suspicion would be once you formalize something, it's no different than while you may represent it as a network, and this is the intended set of connections, that's not how a natural system emerges.
Okay.
And so and again, I've never done that. I think about that in the organizations that I've worked with, and just the uncertainty of creating a network as the formal entity would spaz, half the people I work with out. And I would have to almost create the illusion of, this is the way it's going to work. But I think the reality is, no matter what you map out formally, on a day-to-day basis, it's been my experience that something different emerges.
Okay.
I don't know if it would stifle. I really would have no way of knowing that. But thank you. I much more clearly understand your question.
Michael, I really appreciated Alan's question. I'm sorry. No, it wasn't Alan. It was this person up here, which I don't know.
Mark.
His name.
Mark.
Mark. What I'm hearing here is that once you have created an image, that becomes almost symbolic and forms and influences. And so just shifting to a network one, yes, it may give a sense of this is dynamic, but if it's on a paper or even in a still-ish image, it's still a still image. Am I hearing it right?
That is my belief. And the reason I have that belief is because what you see in front of you right now is a static snapshot at a point in time of how these people were interacting. 6 months from the time that this snapshot was taken, these people are interacting in a completely different manner. So I believe that no matter how you cast the organization, if you create this space, enough enabling space on the front end, the organization is going to morph into a different entity over time regardless. And it's my fundamental belief that that's exactly what we as complexity science people have been arguing for and advocating for years. So I think it doesn't matter how you cast it, it's going to merge into something different.
What it suggests to me is that with all these arguments about Big Brother watching and all the data being collected, I can imagine for a company to have some big screen that says, this is the current movement.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
not that I vote for that.
I'd like to say that's how I ran a project with 43 people, and it was tremendously dynamic and fluid. And what would happen is that, every other week, people would shift into different roles, and I just kept that up to date, in the network format. I just found the network format presentation of how people interact much more useful than the hierarchical format, because we had some people who weren't, they didn't have these high titles, but they were in these extremely important jobs. So if I just called them staff members versus, the liaison to the Alaskan project, it gave them more of a sense of their value, even though it was just symbolic.
Yeah, no, I think that can be valuable, especially if you're updating it and people will see it and you're given, so let me go back. Here is a illustration. So this particular map is a dynamic map. This one does change over time. We actually have created a web-based interface where you can look at this map and find out where you are and find out who you're connected to in such a way that you can use it. And I think, Mark, now that I understand your question more clearly, this is what you were expressing. You can now use this map help navigate in a much more intentional manner. And that's exactly true. That is what happened
that's
here.
what I was hoping to hear.
Yeah.
Michael?
Yeah, and it's hard to do that all the time, but in some cases you can contract for that. Yes.
I have a slightly different question. Slightly different question, I think. This is Brooke. So if I get this question out half properly, so when I'm listening, interpreting what you're saying, and looking at the slide, it seems like this has been applied to the tip of the spear moving forward in an organization for the future. Mm-hmm. My question is, to what extent have you seen, found, or tried to do this in the operations side? The big green area.
Great question. And the answer is on a limited basis only. We are beginning to think about this concept of agility at core. My presumption up until now, Brooke, has been that that you have agility. Agility at scale is a bit of a misnomer. I'm not sure I'm right on my next sentence, by the way, but I'm just laying it out here. Agility at scale is a bit of a misnomer. And if you think about it, this has been my argument. You want parts of your organization to be geared and designed to deliver with precision, durability, predictability, because they're serving existing customer populations, and you got all the risk, right? Reputational risk. And that's what these large entities have been designed for. So my presumption up until now has been, I want agility on the edges. And then I want to think about this from an ambidexterity. I almost want a bimodal organization. I want one mode here and another mode there, and I need the bridges to connect the two. We're beginning to experiment in one scenario, one case, where could you have agility in the core, where you're flowing people. So think about it this way. This is the best analogy I can think about. Rather than, think of an assembly line where something is moving down the assembly line, and rather than having, a single static entity where everybody does their one thing, could you do much more of a swarm and storm to where different entities were flocking in, flowing in as two pizza teams? And then I oftentimes think about in the Indy cars where you got the lollipop guy. And I oftentimes think about, could you stage development in the core where you're flocking in with agile, small, two pizza, single purpose teams in a very rapid fashion? So those are some of the things that we're beginning to experiment with, and frankly have built a simulation, a computer simulation, but in practicality haven't been able to bring it to life yet.
So it sounds like that this is applicable. I think what you just articulated, I think, is also, it's more applicable to the knowledge work side. And the question is, how do you then iteratively and in a smaller basis adapt and infuse the knowledge, the result of that knowledge work side, into the normal operations production side? Is that
exactly right? That's exactly right. And I think that's a new frontier. And I've got some opinions, but that's all they are at this stage.
I got plenty of opinions myself, so yes. So one of the questions is, so especially in an organization historically that's large and structured, what were some of the specific things that you found successful in getting some of these steps, actions, and ideas actually be accepted?
Yeah. So this is really where I lean into the complexity science space. The first thing is pressure, right? So we know that pressures from the outside environment are essential to loosen up tight organizations, very strongly designed organizations. So if you don't have pressure, if you have insularity, you can't make this stuff happen. So the first thing is just this whole concept of leveraging external pressure. Also the historic image and perceptions of an organization. It's easy to completely sort of blow something up, but really appreciating backwards the historical rituals and using those as pivot points, are important. So when we really went back and looked at the complexity science theory and start to think about the history and how history informs and patterns, and looking at things like language and tags, and then we also look externally at really sort of playing in the pressures so that you can loosen up systems. I mean, those are some of the things that were very necessary to get things started.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question about schools, Michael, if there's time.
Please.
I work with small schools, and there's a lot of different networks that you could map in these schools based on personality types and leadership roles and all that. But when it comes to the pressure, the schools have pressure to change, improve, and reduce the achievement gap is one of the themes. And what have you seen in a context of where this is like knowledge work, but it's helping inspire and liberate kids to learn things better. The way the people work together makes a huge difference in how well that works.
Yeah. I admittedly don't have lots of access and experience with schools. So that's the first thing I would say. So I don't understand that system in the way that I could truly articulate this. From a higher education, I do. What I have found is that the local interactions in higher education, and just with real brief, sort of exposure to primary education, is that you've got the local interactions aren't the problem. The local pockets, the entrepreneurial pockets seem to be very vibrant in those communities where people want to make change. It's been, and I think this may go back to Mark's original question, it's the stifling effect of the regulations and institutional rules and guidelines that really strangle out and stifle out, those energized pockets from having a scalable impact. So I don't know if that's true in the experiences that you have, Stephen, but what I would say is that it's hard to get these things up off the ground when you've got deeply regulated entities. I think this is true in healthcare a bit as well. We saw this very much in healthcare. Regulations and these pressures that are coming to this individual contributors or individual interactions that are very bureaucratic stifle this stuff and don't ever give it enough of a chance to get off the ground. So I don't know if that would be the case, and I just haven't studied schools in such a way that I would be able to answer any more, sort of deliberately than that.
Thank you.
I just typed in, Michael, thank you. We could probably go on. You said you could go on for a long time. We could go on for a long time. So I have about 8 pages of notes, but I'll just send you privately. But this has been tremendous, and I want to be respectful of everybody's time here, especially yours, and hope that we can invite you back at some point to continue this conversation. And also for everybody else who's here, please, send us your comments and questions. And I think there's a lot of energy around this. So I see a Plexus project maybe popping up. So I really appreciate it. And the book is tremendous. So I suggest everyone go out and get a copy as well. Michael, thank you so much for sharing this with us, and hope that we'll continue to be in conversation.
Sounds great, Denise. Thank you very much. And great talking to everyone. Enjoy your day.
Thanks so much.